On the morning we buried my father, my brother stood up at the front of the church, looked out at 200 people who had known our family for 40 years, and told them our father's last wish was to leave me nothing. Not a dollar, not the house, not the store our grandfather built with his own 2 hands on Route 9 in 1961. I sat in the second pew in a black dress I'd bought the day before, and I didn't argue. I didn't cry there either, not in front of everyone. I just listened to my brother's voice shake with the kind of grief that gets applause, and I thought about a sentence my father used to say to me when I was young enough to still believe every word out of his mouth. Paper doesn't lie, Lena. People do. 6 weeks later, I was standing in the attic of that same house with a flashlight clenched in my teeth and a screwdriver in my hand, prying insulation away from a wall my father had built himself 30 years earlier. And behind it was a safe my brother didn't know existed. I want to tell you exactly what was inside it, because it didn't just change a will. It ended my brother's career. It ended his marriage. And it finally answered a question I had been quietly asking my whole life without ever once saying it out loud. Did my father love me, or did he just feel sorry for me? If you're new here, welcome to Dark Revenge. We're the people who lose the loudest arguments in the room, usually win the quiet ones later. This channel is built around one kind of story: ordinary people who get lied about, pushed out, or written out of their own families, and who fight their way back the only way that actually holds up in the end. With paperwork, with patience, with the truth, said once, in a room where it finally counts. If that's the kind of justice you came here for, stay through this whole one, tell me in the comments where in the country you're listening from tonight, and subscribe so the next story finds you when it drops. Now let me take you back 4 months, to a birthday dinner, because that is really where all of this started. My name is Elena Marsh. Everyone but my father called me Lena. I'm 41, and I run a small forensic accounting practice out of a converted storefront in Cedar Rapids, about 90 minutes from the town I grew up in. Companies hire me when their own books stop making sense to them, when a longtime bookkeeper retires and the replacement finds numbers that don't line up, when a business partner starts changing the subject anytime someone asks about the general ledger. I spend my days reading spreadsheets the way some people read faces. I've gotten good at noticing when a number is trying too hard to look normal. It isn't glamorous work. Nobody chases anyone down a parking garage. I sit with 3 monitors and too much coffee, and I follow a dollar until it finally tells me the truth about where it went. But the job taught me something that turned out to matter more than any of the letters after my name. People can lie to your face in a sentence without even blinking. It's a lot harder to lie inside a ledger because a ledger has to balance. Eventually, it always does. I grew up in Miller's Creek, a town of about 6,000 people built around a grain elevator and a 2-block main street with a diner on one end and a church on the other. My father, Walter Marsh, owned Marsh Hardware and Feed, the same store his own father had opened. Half the county owed him a small favor at one point or another. He'd extended credit to struggling farms more times than I can count, written it down in a green ledger he kept behind the register, and never once raised his voice about a late payment. He believed, the way some men believe in scripture, that if you were fair with people long enough, the world eventually paid you back in kind. I loved him. That part of the story was never complicated. What was complicated was my brother. Derek is 3 years older than me. Our mother, Susan, died of ovarian cancer when I was 12 and he was 15, and I've always thought something in our father simply closed after that, the way a store closes for renovation and quietly never opens back up quite the same. He kept us fed and dressed and standing up straight in the 3rd pew every Sunday, but he stopped being a man who talked about feelings if he had ever really been one to begin with. What I remember most from those years is how differently he seemed to need us. Derek looked exactly like him, same square jaw, same habit of standing with his weight shifted onto one hip whenever he was thinking something over. I think our father looked at Derek and saw a version of himself that hadn't lost anything yet. So he gave Derek the things a boy in a small town measures himself against. A used Ford pickup the summer he turned 16. A shotgun for his 18th birthday that had belonged to my grandfather. A job at the store with his own name stitched onto the apron in gold thread. What he gave me was different, and for a long time I read it as smaller. He gave me his old adding machine from the store, the one with the curling paper tape, and taught me to run a column of numbers without a calculator, standing behind me at the kitchen table with his hand resting over mine. He drove 3.5 hours through a February snowstorm to watch me finish 11th in a regional cross-country meet, and never once mentioned what the drive had cost him. He showed up 20 minutes late to my college graduation because the store had been broken into that same morning, and he never fully explained why that mattered more than being on time, and for years I never fully forgave him for it. I used to believe Derek got the kind of love that came easy, and I got the kind that came out of guilt. I was wrong about that. I just didn't know it yet. By the time I left for college, Derek had already settled into the role he would play for the rest of his adult life. Local. Dependable looking. He took a job as a loan officer at Millers Creek Savings Bank straight out of community college, married a woman named Carrie who ran the front desk at the dentist's office 2 doors down from the bank, and stayed exactly where everybody in town expected him to stay. I moved to Cedar Rapids, earned my CPA license, and became, in the eyes of most of Millers Creek, the daughter who left. That label followed me around for 20 years. It followed me right up until the day it mattered the most. My father turned 74 on a Saturday in March. I drove down for it, brought a pound cake because he never cared much for anything too sweet, and walked into a house that smelled like pot roast and, underneath that, something I couldn't quite name yet. Something a little off. He seemed smaller than the last time I'd seen him, only 3 months earlier. Quieter. He forgot the name of our old dog twice during dinner, a dog that had been dead for 11 years, which we all laughed about at the table, the particular way families laugh about the things they're actually afraid of. Derek kept steering the conversation whenever our father trailed off mid-sentence, finishing his thoughts for him with a little too much confidence, like a man narrating a tour he'd given 100 times before. Then, over pie, Derek set a manila folder on the table. "Dad and I got some paperwork squared away," he said, sliding it toward me like it was nothing at all. "Power of attorney. Financial stuff. Just makes things easier if anything ever happens." I opened it. It was dated 6 weeks earlier. My father's signature was there, shaky but still recognizably his, notarized by a name I didn't recognize. "Dad," I said, "you did this. You remember doing this." My father looked at the folder like he was seeing it for the very first time in his life. "If Derek says we did it, he said, and laughed a little and reached for his coffee. It was the kind of laugh people use to cover up the fact that they're lost. I didn't say anything else that night. I told myself he was just tired. I told myself Derek was finally being responsible for once in his life. I made the 90-minute drive home in the dark, telling myself a story I badly wanted to be true. But I need you to remember that folder, because everything that followed started right there, on a Saturday in March, with a father who couldn't quite recall signing away control of his own accounts to the son who had handed him the pen. I started visiting more after that, every other Saturday instead of once a month, and I told myself it was only about spending more time with him while I still could. Some of that was true, but I was also watching, the way I watch a client's books when something feels wrong before I can name it. I noticed the store's supplier invoices had a new vendor listed, a company called Heartland Renovation Group, billing $11,000 a month for work I never once saw a contractor actually doing. I noticed my father was cycling through the same 3 flannel shirts, though Derek kept telling people at church he was taking real good care of Dad now. I noticed that when I called the house on weekday afternoons, Carrie answered more often than my father did, and there was always some reason he couldn't come to the phone just then. In April, I asked to see the store's books, the way I'd been doing informally for years, mostly to help him get ready for tax season. Derek told me, pleasant as anything, that he was handling all of that now, and that Dad didn't want to trouble me with it. Dad didn't want to trouble me with it. My father had never once used that sentence about anything in his entire life. He'd have handed me a shoebox of receipts before he ever let someone else run interference for him. I sat in my car outside the store that afternoon, the same way I sit outside a client's office right before I have to tell them their numbers don't match their story, and I felt something I recognized from work but had never once felt about my own family before. I felt the shape of a lie before I'd found a single piece of proof of it. Here's what I need you to understand about how I operate, because it's the only reason any of what happened next held up under pressure later. I don't accuse. I document. I started small. I pulled a certified copy of that power of attorney from the county recorder's office, and had a lawyer I trusted quietly review the notarization on it. I began photographing bank statements whenever I visited, tucked in a drawer my father still let me open freely. I asked our elderly neighbor, Mrs. Okafor, who'd known our family for 30 years, if she'd noticed anything unusual, and she told me, carefully, that she'd seen Derek's truck parked at the house at strange hours, and that the mail carrier had mentioned my father's mail had briefly been rerouted to a P.O. box he didn't seem to remember setting up. In May, I drove down on a weekday unannounced and took my father to lunch alone, just the two of us. Away from Derek and Carrie, away from the house, he was sharper than he'd seemed in months. He asked about my cat. He remembered my ex-boyfriend's name and asked, with real concern, whether things had ever worked out for me there. And when I gently brought up the power of attorney, he went quiet and looked out at the parking lot for a long moment and said something I have turned over in my mind every single day since. Derek says I get confused sometimes, he told me. Maybe I do. Then he looked back at me, and for one clear second, the fog seemed to lift completely. But I know I built something for you kids that Derek doesn't know about. I just can't remember exactly where I put the key. I didn't push him. I just held his hand across the table and told him it was all right. We'd figure it out together, no rush. But I drove home that night and called Grace Whitfield, an elder law attorney a colleague had recommended, and I told her everything I'd noticed. She listened the way good lawyers do, without a single interruption, and when I finished, she said one sentence I wrote down on a legal pad and never threw away. If even half of what you're describing turns out to be true, your father needs a paper trail a great deal more than he needs a rescue. So that's exactly what I built him. Quietly, over the next 3 months, I gathered records the way I gather them for total strangers every day of my working life. Bank statements, the strange notarization, vendor invoices for renovation work that never actually happened. And I kept turning over that one sentence in my mind, looking for the key my father had mentioned, without knowing yet what it was even meant to open. If you've ever watched someone you love get quietly taken advantage of, and felt like the only person in the family who noticed, stay with me, because this story gets harder before it gets better. And if it's landing for you already, take 5 seconds right now and hit subscribe. On Dark Revenge, we cover exactly this kind of story: inheritance fights, hidden wills, elder financial abuse, and the calm, legal way ordinary people eventually take their families back. All right, let's keep going. My father died on a Tuesday in July of a heart attack, alone in the house, found the next morning by Carrie when she stopped by to drop off groceries. When I heard, I sat in a parking lot in Cedar Rapids and cried the way I hadn't cried since I was 12 years old, and for a while, none of it mattered to me anymore, not the accounts, not the invoices, not the strange notarization. I just wanted my father back. I didn't get to grieve quietly for very long. At the funeral home 2 days later, Derek told me, right in front of the funeral director, that Dad's most recent will left the store, the house, and every account entirely to him, to keep things simple. When I asked to see it, he said his lawyer would send it over. He never did. At the church during the reception, I overheard him tell our Aunt Ruth, loud enough for me to catch every word, that I'd basically left this family 15 years ago and only came back around once Dad got sick. A woman I'd known my whole life, one of Mom's old friends from the choir, squeezed my hand by the casket and told me, with real pity in her voice, that it was such a shame we two hadn't gotten more time together at the end. I understood, standing there, that Derek had spent months quietly writing the story everyone in Miller's Creek was now repeating about me, the same patient way he'd spent months writing checks to a company that didn't actually exist. Then came the eulogy. Standing behind that pulpit, in front of 200 people, Derek said our father's last wish had been to leave me nothing, because I had chosen my career over my own family, and Dad had made his peace with that before he died. I sat in the second pew and did not correct him, not because I believed a single word of it, but because I finally understood, with total clarity, that I was never going to win this argument standing in a church, raising my voice, in front of a room that had already decided who I was. I was going to win it the only way I have ever won anything in my life. With paper. The house sat empty for 3 weeks while Derek handled, in his own words, the estate stuff, which mostly seemed to mean a for sale sign going up in the yard of the house I'd grown up in. Because I was still listed as a secondary contact on an old insurance policy, and because Grace had already sent Derek a formal letter putting him on notice that I intended to review any will presented for probate, I still had a legal right to collect personal belongings from the property. I used it. I went up to the attic on a Saturday afternoon in August, in the exact kind of heat that used to make the whole house smell like cedar and dust every summer of my childhood. I wasn't looking for anything specific at first. I was looking for photo albums. And then, tucked behind a stack of my old high school yearbooks, I found a cigar box holding a single brass key and no label at all. I remembered what my father had told me over lunch back in May. I just can't remember exactly where I put the key. It took 2 hours of running my hands along the attic's north wall, the same wall he'd insulated himself the summer I turned 14, before I found a seam in the drywall that didn't quite line up with the studs around it. Behind it was a small floor safe, the kind you'd buy for a home office, bolted straight into the joists beneath the boards. The key didn't fit it. It was a combination lock instead. I sat there in the heat for a long while, thinking about my father, about the things that mattered to him, the numbers that meant something in his life. And then I tried the one date I should have thought of first. My mother's birthday. The safe opened on the third try. Inside was a green ledger, the same kind he kept behind the register my entire childhood, except this one had nothing to do with the store. It was labeled, in his own handwriting, for Elena when you're ready. Underneath it sat a stack of documents that Grace would later spend a full week combing through with me, line by line. A handwritten, properly witnessed will, dated 14 months before he died, naming me executor and splitting the estate evenly between Derek and me, with the store itself specifically protected. A folder of bank statements he had printed himself, with red pens circled around every single Heartland Renovation Group withdrawal. An unsent letter addressed to Grace's law firm, describing his growing suspicion that Derek was handling money that isn't adding up the way he keeps telling me it is. And a small digital recorder, the kind you'd use to dictate notes to yourself, holding 11 audio files. The last one had been recorded 9 days before he died. I didn't listen to it up there in the attic. I drove straight to Grace's office with the entire contents of that safe packed into a banker's box on the passenger seat, and we listened to it together, in her conference room, with the blinds pulled down. My father's voice on that recording was steadier than it had been in months. He talked about the store, about wanting it to still exist for his grandchildren someday, about being genuinely afraid of forgetting things, and afraid of exactly what that fear made him vulnerable to. And then he said something that changed the entire shape of the case Grace was quietly building on my behalf. A full year before he died, without telling either of his children, my father had transferred ownership of Marsh Hardware and Feed into an irrevocable trust, with Miller's Creek Savings Bank itself serving as trustee, specifically to protect the business from ever being sold or borrowed against by one heir acting alone. He'd done it, he explained on the recording, after Derek asked him twice within 6 months for a large personal loan against the store's equity to cover what Derek vaguely called some bad bets. And our father, for the very first time in his life, had quietly stopped believing his own son's explanation, which meant the will Derek had waved around at the funeral home, the one leaving him the entire store, was leaving him something he could not legally sell, could not legally mortgage, and did not, in any real sense, fully own, no matter what any will on paper claimed. Our father had protected it a full year before his death, from inside a bank where Derek himself worked, using a trust officer Derek had never once thought to ask about, because it had genuinely never occurred to Derek that our father might quietly stop believing him. There was a second piece, one that took Grace another 2 weeks to confirm through the bank's compliance department, working backward from the account numbers written in my father's own ledger. Heartland Renovation Group wasn't a renovation company at all. It was a shell account Derek had opened using his own position at the bank, funneling roughly $190,000 out of our father's accounts over 14 months, using the same power of attorney our father barely remembered signing, to cover gambling debts Derek had never once mentioned to anyone in the family, including his own wife. Grace closed the folder and looked at me for a long moment before she spoke again. "Your father wasn't confused," she said. "He was building a case. He simply ran out of time to finish it himself. I want to be clear about exactly what I did next, because it matters to me that people understand this was never about rage. It was about math. Grace filed a petition to admit my father's later valid will into probate, along with the recordings, the ledger, and a full forensic accounting summary I prepared myself, the same kind of report I write for total strangers every week of my working life, except this time the numbers belonged to my own family. We also filed formal notice with the trust department at Miller's Creek Savings Bank confirming the store's protected status, and because the bank had a legal obligation to investigate any employee using his position to open a shell account, Grace made certain that notice reached both their compliance office and, eventually, the state's banking regulator. Derek's lawyer fought the will for a little over a month. Then the bank quietly placed Derek on administrative leave, pending an internal investigation, and his lawyer stopped fighting quite so hard. The probate hearing was held in the county courthouse on a cold morning in October. I wish I could tell you it felt like victory walking in, but mostly it felt like exhaustion, the specific kind that comes from finally setting down a heavy box you've been carrying for months without complaint. My Aunt Ruth was there. A few of my father's longtime customers were there too, the same people who had once patted my hand with pity at the funeral. Derek sat beside his lawyer in a suit that no longer seemed to fit him quite right. Grace never once raised her voice. She laid the whole case out the way my father used to lay out a column of figures, one line at a time, until the total was the only conclusion left standing in the room. The recording played there in that courtroom, my father's voice filling a space full of people who'd spent months believing he had chosen Derek over me without a second thought. When it reached the part where he said he trusted me to protect what he'd built, I watched my Aunt Ruth press her hand flat over her mouth. The judge admitted the later will. The trust held exactly as it was designed to. The court referred the Heartland Renovation Group withdrawals to the district attorney's office for review, and 3 months after that hearing, Derek was formally charged with financial exploitation of a dependent adult and ultimately pled guilty to a reduced charge in exchange for full restitution and 5 years of probation. The bank fired him before the plea agreement was even finalized. His mortgage license was suspended pending the state's own separate review. I never once raised my voice through any part of it. I didn't need to. My father had already said everything that needed saying quietly into a small recorder 9 days before the end of his life. I just made certain the right people finally got to hear it. People sometimes ask me if I feel like I won. I don't think winning is really the right word for any of this. What I got back were my father's letters. What I got back was his voice, sitting on a small recorder I still keep in a drawer at home and haven't been able to bring myself to listen to again, not yet. I kept the store open. It didn't fully make sense financially, not really. But the trust structure my father had built meant I could run it as executor without ever having to sell it off in pieces, and something in me needed the lights of Marsh hardware and feed to stay on, at least for a while longer. I hired back the 2 employees Derek had quietly let go the year before. I found, taped inside the back cover of that green ledger, a note in my father's handwriting about wanting to someday start a small scholarship for kids from Miller's Creek who wanted to learn a trade or run a small business of their own one day. I'm setting that up now, through the trust in his name. Aunt Ruth and I talk on the phone every week now. She apologized once for the things she believed at the funeral, and I told her she didn't need to because I understood exactly how convincing Derek could sound when he needed to be. Derek and Carrie divorced that winter. I don't know most of the details, and at some point I noticed I had stopped needing to. I still drive down to Miller's Creek most Saturdays. I stand behind the same register my father stood behind for over 40 years, and every so often an old customer will tell me some small story about him I'd never once heard before, some quiet kindness he never mentioned to me himself, and I add it to the picture of him I'm still slowly putting together, piece by piece, the way you'd reconcile an account that finally balances. I don't feel angry anymore when I think back on that eulogy. I think about the safe instead. About a man who was quietly losing pieces of his own memory and still found the discipline, the sheer stubborn will, to build a paper trail strong enough to protect his daughter from 3 states away, from inside a failing mind, using nothing but a green ledger and a combination he somehow knew I'd eventually think to try. Paper doesn't lie. People do. He taught me that at a kitchen table when I was 7 years old, and it took him one final, quiet act to prove he had meant it about both of us the entire time. If you've ever been the one written out of the story while somebody else got to write it, I hope this reminded you that the truth doesn't need you to shout. It just needs you to keep the receipts. If this one stayed with you, tell me in the comments what you would have done differently in my place. hit subscribe so you don't miss the next story, and share this with someone who needs to hear that quiet people win too. This has been Dark Revenge, where we cover the family betrayals, the hidden wills, and the calm, legal justice nobody sees coming until it's already done. I'll see you in the next one.